You know, uh, one of my favorite, if I had any favorites, one of my favorite Bible stories, particularly in the Old Testament, is the story of Joseph. And I suppose it's one of my favorites because there are just so many lessons taught in his life. But I want to just talk briefly, summarize the story, and then draw some implications and lessons out of that for us today. So Joseph, and I really want to begin in Genesis chapter 37. So it's in the latter part of Genesis where we read all of this. But in Genesis 37, Joseph is at this time about 17 years old. And Jacob was his father, and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, the wives of Jacob, they all had their favorites. That's one of the surprising points of the story. You think, okay, yeah, Jacob was a faithful individual, all of that, but they had their problems. They had their family problems, which there's no such thing as a family that doesn't have some kind of problems. So they had their problems, and Jacob had his favorites. Rachel and Leah had theirs, and one of Joseph's or Jacob's favorite was Joseph and Benjamin. Those are the two kids that he seemed to favor. And we know that anytime kids are favored by parents, it's not good news because kids pick up on that and they end up having strife with one another. And that's exactly what happens with this family. It's a big family, a lot of kids. So I suspect Jacob's favorites was Joseph and Benjamin, partly because his favorite wife, Rachel, was the one who bore those two kids. But be that as it may, they had this going on and the strife, and so it came to pass that Joseph had this dream, and he told his brothers this dream. He probably should have kept it quiet, but he told his brothers this dream, and the dream was, basically, you guys are going to worship me. That was my dream, that you all are going to worship me. Of course, that made them mad. They already don't like him very well. And so they're thinking Joseph thinks he's better than everybody. Long story short, they did the unthinkable. They trafficked him out to Egypt. Well, initially it was to these slave owners. And I'm making a long story very short, but they got rid of him. At first they wanted to kill him, but had this idea, we can just traffic him out. He doesn't have to die. He's gone. He's out of our hair. So they do that. Again, Joseph is about 17 years old at this point. And those who buy Joseph, and in the ancient world, just like in the modern world, there's trafficking going on. So those who bought Joseph ends up selling him to Egypt. And in the process, Joseph basically grows up and has a name for himself. And some good things are going well. Now, I want to just pause here to think, before we think it's all going so well, really think about Joseph's plight. His entire life is uprooted at 17 years old. No doubt, I don't know, like most 17-year-olds, he has maybe hopes and dreams, or he's thinking his life, his future is going to be a certain way, and it's gone. That part of his plans, whatever they might have been, his life, whatever it would have been, is gone. And it was taken from him. Horrifying, really, when you think about it. And it's certainly not something that people think of when they think of a life dedicated to God, or a life that would be later faithful to God. But that's what happens. And the Bible is real. It tells us what really happened, and it tells us about real life. Bad things happen to good people. Frankly, none of us are good in the sense of deserving, but things happen that people don't outright deserve. And this happens to Joseph. He's sold away from his family. horrifying when you think about it. When you really let that sink in, it's just a nightmare, a terrifying situation which happens too often today. But be that as it may, he is trafficked into Egypt and he becomes sort of a slave. But while in Egypt, he does make the best of his situation, and he maintains his faithfulness to God. In fact, he seems to grow in his faithfulness to God. At first, in his youth, he kind of seems like he's a little impetuous, maybe a little immature. I don't know. But definitely by the time he gets to Egypt and establishes himself there, he is faithful to God no matter what is happening. Joseph is doing that. He's just a great example of that. So much so that this leader in Egypt by the name of Potiphar has a wife who basically makes moves on Joseph, and Joseph says, I ain't doing this and sinning against God and sinning against your husband. No. He says no. He denies her advances. Well, she, on one evening, makes advances toward him. He rejects them, and she takes a coat of his, and this coat, by the way, that was initially given as a gift, now becomes sort of a curse. She takes this coat of Joseph, she presents it to her husband and says, Joseph tried to make a move on me, and I ran away, and here's his coat as evidence to prove that he assaulted me, basically. And Potiphar, he's in a situation, he respects Joseph, probably is suspicious about the story, but he has no choice. He punishes Joseph. He sends him to jail. So just when you think, okay, it's, bad is bad, the guy, he's uprooted, his whole life is uprooted, and now he's thrown in jail for something he didn't do. We might think anybody in that situation would have a right to complain a little bit. I mean, some people might think, where's God in all this? He seems to be very absent, at least on the surface of it when we think about it. And so he's in jail. And while they're in jail, a couple others become prisoners there. And Joseph, by the way, makes a reputation there. He ends up, the prison guards respect Joseph. They put him in a position where he's basically in charge of other prisoners. They trust him. So here it is, again, Joseph making the most of a very unfortunate situation. He's faithful to God. He doesn't let go of his faithfulness. What a man. What a faithful man. But while there's some other prisoners there that come into jail, and they were in the court of Pharaoh. Basically, they were Pharaoh's butler and baker. So they basically make Pharaoh angry, and Pharaoh puts them in jail, and they have some dreams there. No doubt dreams that were inspired by God. And they tell Joseph about these dreams, and Joseph interprets these dreams. And they come to pass. And what happens is one of them dies, and the other one is released from jail. And he realizes, hey, Joseph told us exactly what was going to happen. This is amazing. But he forgets about Joseph. Joseph stays in jail for another 2 whole years before anything else happens. And everybody's just forgotten Joseph. For another 2 whole years, he's just forgotten. Not another word, not another thing said about him. Well, after those 2 years, Pharaoh starts having these dreams, nightmares, and he's concerned about them. Again, probably, no doubt, inspired by God, but he doesn't know what to make of these dreams, these dreams that keep repeating. Nobody could interpret these dreams for the Pharaoh, but the guy who came out of jail remembered. Wait a second, I remember this guy in jail when I was in prison. a couple of years back, he told me and my friend about the future and what was going to happen. He interpreted our dreams for us, and he was dead on the money. So Pharaoh, desperate to want to know and understand these dreams, says, go bring him to me. And so Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Essentially, the dream was that there was going to be, and this is how Joseph interpreted it, again, by God's inspiration, but Joseph said there's going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt. I mean, there's going to be more than you need, food and crops, etc. But then after those 7 years, there's going to be another 7 years of absolute famine and pestilence. It's going to be, and it's going to be basically nearly worldwide. And so Joseph comes up with this plan. Pharaoh's, of course, concerned about this, but Joseph comes up with this plan. He says, you know, for those first 7 years, if you organize it right, and if you save enough correctly, you'll have enough to be fine in the next 7 years when there's these 7 years of hard luck and famine, and Egypt will be fine. Well, so 7 years goes by, and Pharaoh likes this, so Pharaoh puts Joseph in a powerful position in Egypt. So some things are looking up for Joseph. So those 7 years goes by, and sure enough, exactly as Joseph predicted, they had plenty, food, everything that they needed. And then the next 7 years, and in the process of those next 7 years, there is famine and just no food at all. But Egypt was fine. Joseph's plan and organization works out perfectly. Well, okay, so what on earth is going on over here in Egypt? Now, we could scratch our heads, and if we could just sit and get to know Joseph on a daily basis, it would be hard to see that what good is coming out of all this. I mean, we're talking, and by the way, the Bible says that Joseph is about 30 years old by the time that he is brought to Pharaoh's court, you know, where he rises to power. So between the ages of 17 to 30, think about that. I mean, we're talking, 13 years, 13 long years. Joseph's life seems to be going nowhere but down. 13 years is a long time. I know a lot of people who, they can't handle 13 days. Some can't handle 13 hours of hard luck without nearly giving up their faith on God. This is 13 years. And everything bad, just when things seem to go well, it's just taken away from him. Joseph could have easily been one of these people that just says, there's just, what's the benefit of serving God? I mean, is God even there? I mean, the horrible things keep happening to me. It's not fair. I mean, my brothers, they're allowed to be back home, and they're the ones who put me here. Everybody else, even one of them, the baker and the butler, one of them died, but one of them at least was able to go out of jail, and they're fine, and they are guilty. I was innocent. I do the right thing, and I get in trouble for it. But Joseph doesn't do that. I mean, really let that sink in. It's almost as if Joseph knew and learned that no matter where he was going to serve God. And he did. So, going back to the famine. So the famine was spread throughout the world. And lo and behold, Egypt was the only place that had everything, that had enough food and enough shelter. Everything was fine. That people tried to travel to Egypt, and because the famine was worldwide. Well, Joseph's family, Jacob and his children, or Joseph's brothers and sisters, they're all back home in the famine. And Jacob says, I've heard Egypt, there's plenty in Egypt. We're going to die out here. So he sends his brothers to Egypt to try to get food and buy food and bring it. Well, while Joseph's brothers go to Egypt, Joseph learns of them and meets them. They don't know who Joseph is. Remember, it's been some years now. And they don't recognize him at first. And Joseph kind of plays with him a bit, but he basically demands that they bring Jacob and his brother Benjamin to Egypt. And so they do. Long story, very short. They do, and they learn, oh, this is Joseph. And Joseph tells them who he is, and they're crying on each other, and they're just happy. Jacob learns for the first time his son was not dead because his brothers had lied years ago and told him that some animal ate him. It killed him. All right, so here's the story. So it turns out to be good in the end. But what is Joseph? What can we learn from Joseph along the way through this? How can you apply this situation, this story to you? Well, one thing I think we learn patience when life takes a path you did not plan. Life does take paths that we don't plan. And it's hard for us sometimes to see that we are not on planet Earth solely for ourselves. And sometimes we do come up with our own, we think this is what our future is going to look like. This is where we want it to go. And it goes anywhere but where we think it's going to go. And sometimes it's outside of our control. Sometimes people have abused. Maybe people have abused you, or people have misused you, people have taken advantage, or maybe your future was robbed from you. And it just looks completely different. Well, Joseph has unbelievable patience that even though his future's robbed from him, as from his perspective, growing up, he's patient. He waits on God. He waits on God for those 2 years while in jail. He waits for God those other years as he finally gets to Pharaoh's court. And even then, there's some patience. But patience, that's so hard, isn't it? But the second thing I think we learn is contentment. Contentment when life takes you places you did not want to be. So patience when life takes a path you did not plan, and contentment when life takes you places you did not want to be or never wanted to be. Joseph obviously didn't want to get sold into Egypt initially. Of course not. He was robbed from his home, taken away from his family. And then on top of it, obviously, he didn't want to be in jail. He didn't want to be wrongfully accused by Potiphar's wife. He didn't want, there's a lot of things Joseph did not want or plan or choose. He didn't want to be in these places. He wanted to be everywhere but you look at Joseph and you see contentment. Oh my word, contentment such that I'm deeply and profoundly impressed when people has this sort of patience and contentment, where they're in situations that are not just less than ideal, they're everything but where they would want to be in life. And I'm reminded of 1 Timothy, as this convicts my heart, and sometimes we complain when our day, it doesn't go exactly as we plan. Sometimes life takes us on a journey that we didn't plan to go, but it happened to the Apostle Paul too, right? I mean, here he was rising up the ladder of success in Judaism, and all of a sudden he witnesses the resurrection of Jesus. His world is completely turned upside down in a positive way. He loses everything worldly, but he gains everything spiritually. But at times Paul was beaten, at times imprisoned, at times he had good things going, but sometimes he didn't. Horrible things for his following and leading the people of God. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, though, Paul would say this. In verse 6, now godliness with contentment is great gain. Notice, godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, the world doesn't define gain that way. The world defines gain as the American dream, right? The big white picket fence and the big house and the 401k and retirement and, cars and, that's the American dream, materialism. And sometimes it's hard to be content until we have those things, and or life takes us in a direction that or we don't. It doesn't take us in a way that we wished it went. So godliness with contentment is gain, great gain, not just any gain. It's great gain. You think Paul wanted to be where he was so often? No, but he's still seen it as gain. Reminds me of Philippians 1 when Paul said, whether I live or die. To die is better to be with Christ, but, to be here in the flesh is opportunity to serve Christ. He says both are good. But he learned contentment. That major passage that people quote, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. One of the most misquoted passages. Paul's not saying that we can accomplish all things through Christ that strengthens me. Maybe there's some truth to that, but that's not what Paul says. He says, I can do, I can endure, I can get through, I can handle all the problems and the pain that comes my way. I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's what Paul is saying. Because he learned contentment. He allowed his heart not to be too attached to this world. And when we allow our hearts to be too attached to this world, that's when pain just intensifies when we lose it. All right, so he goes, though, we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. If you have food and clothing, Paul says, if you got your bare necessities, be content. Why? Because we're put on this earth for what? 70 years, 80 years, maybe, if we live above the average. You just never know. But it doesn't matter if we live until we're 100 years old. James chapter 4 is still true. Life is but a vapor, and it appears for a little time and vanishes away. You think about eternity compared to the 70, 80 years you might live on this earth. Eternity. Imagine where you're going to be in 1 trillion years. We can't even imagine that kind of length of time. But the further we get out, 1 billion years, 100 billion years, 1 trillion years, this life that we've lived is just going to be smaller and smaller and shrink further and further away. Now, I think it'll always be important to us. This life will. But it's going to shrink into oblivion when you think about when it's swallowed up by eternity, infinity. So no wonder Paul knew this, learned this. He was content. He knew it was a vapor and appeared for a little time. And that we brought nothing in this world, we carry nothing out of it. So having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, caught up into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. You want to get drowned in life? Fall in love with this world. Paul said that you're going to get, it's like a snare, caught up in so many things you just can't enjoy today until you have it. Well, Joseph is the opposite of that. Yeah, so much was taken from him, but he was faithful, he was content, and he made the most of every situation he was in. Even when he was in jail for nothing he did. And he was still worshiping God, serving God, doing God's will. And along the way, people who met Joseph, wherever he was, respected him. And Joseph continued to be a godly presence in the world around him, wherever he was. You see, that should give us a great deal of comfort too. You see, nobody can truly take away your purpose. Nobody can take away the purpose for which you are put on planet Earth. Literally no one. Except maybe yourself, of course. But when you're a Christian and you're following Christ and you're doing His will, literally no one can take away your purpose. No matter where they take you, no matter what they do to you, no matter what it seems or feels like that you just don't have, everywhere you go, you can live the example of Jesus Christ. And that is the purpose in which we're here. To serve God and keep His commandments, as Ecclesiastes would say. For this is the everything of man. Okay, so continuing on. So he learned contentment when life took him places he did not want to be. And again, he didn't, it's not like we need to make sure we know he didn't choose these things. It's not like, oh, it was easy for Joseph. He didn't mind being there. Come on. That's not true. But the other thing, and the last point I want to make, is that in Joseph, we learn to trust in life's purpose, even when it's not known until it's almost over. We need to trust when life's purpose is not known until it's almost over. Sometimes we won't really understand what was supposed to happen in our life until it's done, maybe even after it's done. We may still not fully know. But God can be working out a plan for you. Now, He needs our cooperation. If we don't cooperate in it, we can thwart God's plan by saying no to it. People say no to becoming a Christian. They're saying no to God's intended plan for their life. But if we're cooperating and living for Him, in Him, and with Him, He is guiding you one way or another. And does He allow bad things to happen? Just like Joseph, of course. But He takes the bad things that happen and He uses them for His purposes and His glory. This is what the end of the book of Genesis tells us. We read this toward the end, when again Joseph and his brothers and his father, they all meet and everything's fine, better, and now his family is saved because of what God did with Joseph. Again, Jacob and the sons of Jacob, Israel, would have all died in the famine had not this happened, had Joseph not been in the situation he was in. That's in God's plan. The Messiah, Christ, came through the line of Israel. The whole nation of Israel came from this family. And the family would have been dead if it was not for it. So God saw this. God was working out His plan, and He was working out a plan that would be for the good of all humanity. You see, sometimes God may use you to benefit someone else. He may be using your life to be a benefit to people that you don't even know yet. Might be somebody in the future that you have no idea. You may never meet them. But God may be blessing somebody because of something you did and something He had you did or something He had you do or go to. You don't even know. But here Joseph knew about his family, but we know from Genesis until Exodus, there's about 400 years between Genesis and Exodus. The family of Jacob becomes, the nation of Israel becomes a nation in Egypt. And this is where it begins, though. But Joseph says something to his brothers because they're caught red-handed. They remember what they did to Joseph. They trafficked him and they all this stuff. So Joseph, they lied to their father. But Joseph says, "Do not be afraid," to his brothers. For am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. You see, we don't have God's perspective. God can see from, the 50,000 mile perspective up in the sky. He sees it all. We just see the moment that we're in. And even then, we don't see that very well. But God sees it all. And yes, they meant it for evil against Joseph. And yes, Joseph didn't see it all either. But God did, and he was working it all out, kind of like a chess game. Whatever the enemy did, whatever moves the enemy was making against Joseph, God would make the counter moves, and God knew exactly how the end was going to turn out. And you just see one great big chess game in the life of Joseph, and God, of course, wins checkmate against Satan every time. So they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And this doesn't mean, it's not saying, and I want us to be clear about this, and we're about to be done here, but I want us to be clear. That doesn't mean that the bad things were not bad. It doesn't mean that trafficking Joseph out wasn't a good thing. That wasn't the will of God. It wasn't something God had his brothers do. They did it based on free will. They did it, but God knew that was their chess move against Joseph. God's counter chess move was to bring Joseph into the place where he would accomplish God's purposes. But that was genuinely bad. See, we don't have to believe or think that bad things are not bad things just because God brings about good things from them. Bad things are genuinely bad things. He was trafficked. Horrible. We can call it a tragedy. The fact that Joseph was wrongly accused and put in jail, that's a bad thing. Now, God does powerful things and great things in it. And that's the thing that's sometimes hard for us to wrap our brains around. But it's that one passage in Romans. I'm going to leave you with this passage. I love this passage. Romans chapter 8. But, and you may know this passage. It's often quoted, but Romans 8 and in verse 28. For we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. You see, God, again, he sees the big picture. He can take the bad things that happen, the tragedies of life that absolutely should have never happened. But he can take those things and he can produce and bring out of those things wonderful, powerful things for his purposes, glorious things. And that's what the next verse after that says, that he brings to glory all those who love him. And so we need to learn that. Trust. When life's purposes is not always known until almost the end. Moses was 80 years old before God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt. Jesus was 30 years old before he started his ministry. Jesus came to earth thousands of years after the creation. Humanity had to wait. And there is a lot of waiting in the people of God in their lives. But that's when God works his best. He works in the hearts of those who have patience when life takes the path you did not plan. He can do so much with a heart that is content when life takes you places you did not want to be. And he can do so much with a heart that trusts, even when life's purpose is not understood or fully understood until nearly the end, or even after the end. Trust in the Lord, just as Jesus did and gave us that perfect example, but just as Joseph did, who gave us not a perfect example, but a faithful one. What a life. What an example Joseph is. Hopefully given you some thought, some food for thought. I appreciate you joining me in this study. We'll be looking at in this study, because we have about 3 different studies going on in my channel. We have apologetics or defense for God's existence and things of God. We're looking at encounters with Jesus, but we're also going to be looking at some other faith lessons in the Old Testament specifically. And that's what this study is going to be about. Thank you for joining me. Till next time.